Luxurious, golden-lit first-class waiting room, a 17-year-old black boy. His eyes were calm. He wore a blue shirt that had been ironed the night before, his backpack neatly placed at his feet. The only small detail that revealed that he had come here not by car, but perhaps by the earliest train in the city. No one paid any attention to him, until a pair of high heels clicked on the marble floor, stopping right in front of him. A voice came out, so soft that no one had to look up, but enough to bend the surrounding air into a cold sword. First class isn't for people like you. He looked up. Megan Reed, the airline's veteran flight attendant, with her hair neatly tied back and her uniform unwrinkled, was looking at him as if she'd just discovered something out of place. A few people sitting nearby glanced over. Some sneered, some frowned, some looked away, not because they hadn't heard, but because they were so used to it that they no longer felt the need to respond. Eli, however, said nothing. No argument, no explanation, just a slow blink, enough to swallow the sentence, enough to begin a journey that no one in the room had anticipated, where justice would not knock with a sermon, but with the quiet steps of a father, about to enter the sky that belonged to his son. Eli tightened the strap of his small silver-gray suitcase, his new sneakers glistening under the lights of the JFK airport lobby. He walked in a steady rhythm, his eyes filled with excitement, as if each step brought him closer to a future he had only dared to dream of. No one in the hall knew that Eli had just graduated as valedictorian from a small public high school in suburban Atlanta. No one knew that he had won a full scholarship to Stanford, where only 1% of black students had ever been admitted. And no one knew that the first-class ticket in his coat pocket, neatly folded close to his heart, was more than just a plane ticket. It was a gift from his father, Marcus Brooks, a gift Eli treasured more than anything else in his life. Marcus is not your typical dad. He is a former pilot who built his career from a small aerospace startup to the CEO of Orion Air. That name, Eli has heard it 1,000 times on the phone from his father. Remember, son, you were born to fly. As Eli passed the souvenir shop near Gate 17, his eyes accidentally stopped on an advertising poster. A plane gliding across the sunset sky, the bold words below, "Fly with Orion," founded by Marcus Brooks. Eli paused for a few seconds. Looking at his father's name printed on the poster, among the strangers rushing by, he suddenly felt a strange feeling, both proud and moved. He didn't need to brag about it. For Eli, flying on the wings that his father had built was already a great thing. The announcement from the loudspeakers for Flight 118 to San Francisco began boarding. Eli took a deep breath, adjusted his shirt collar, and smiled slightly. A private ritual to say goodbye to the village schoolboy and welcome the future Stanford student. For Eli, the journey didn't begin the moment the plane took off. It began the moment he stepped into the airport. With a heart full of dreams, and a first-class ticket from the father who taught him, when you know you belong in the sky, no one can pull you down to the ground. No one in first class recognized Eli Brooks this morning. He was a skinny teenager with glasses, no designer watch, no expensive leather backpack. But if anyone knew his father, they knew Eli didn't need any of that to get into first class. Marcus Brooks. The name that makes many CEOs of other airlines look back at the history they always ignore. Before he founded Orion Air, Marcus was a black boy growing up in public housing on South Chicago, where flying planes was an out-of-reach dream. And he started not in the cockpit, but in the belly of the plane, with a broom and a bucket of water. They called him Marcus the Mop, and he didn't care. Because he knew that if he was patient enough to wipe every oil stain, every window frame, one day his hands would touch the control lever, not the mop. Flashback, many years ago. In the dim light of a midnight hangar, Marcus was cleaning the cockpit windshield of an old Boeing. Next to him, a 6-year-old boy curled up in a chair, his head buried in a 5th-grade math book, so soundly asleep that he didn't hear the vacuum cleaner whirring around him. That was Eli. That year, he didn't understand why his father worked all night, but always made it home in the morning to take him to school. Marcus once said, "Respect isn't earned by money or skin. It's in how you treat others." Respect doesn't come from a paycheck. It doesn't come from the color of your skin. It comes from how you treat other people. whether they're the CEO or the little boy who fell asleep in the terminal while his dad cleaned the windshield. He never bought Eli any expensive toys, but every night he read books with him. And every morning, before leaving the house, he put his hand on his son's shoulder and said, "Son, you don't need wings to fly. Just carry your name with dignity." Today, when Eli boarded the first-class cabin of that same airline, no one knew that decades ago, his father had cleaned this cabin with eyes filled with dreams of a fairer world for his son. And perhaps no one expected that. In just a few minutes, Eli would be suspected, questioned, looked at as a guest who did not belong here. Just for one reason: the color of his skin. The hallway leading to first class was gleaming, soft yellow lights reflecting off the thread-free carpet. Eli pulled his small suitcase, slowing his pace as he approached the door that separated two worlds: the bustling economy class behind him, the cream leather seats, champagne, and never-so-innocent stares ahead. Eli knew his ticket. 4A, window aisle, first class. His name was printed clearly on his boarding pass. But as he stepped in, the sound of heels rang out behind him. A female voice, hardened in a smile. "Looks like someone got lost." Eli turned. Standing before him was a tall, blonde woman in a perfectly pressed flight attendant uniform. The name tag read, Megan. Her eyes were not questioning, but accusing. She didn't wait for Eli to answer. She just glanced at her colleague next to her with a, "Did you see that?" look, the kind of look that comes from someone who believes they're keeping the world in order. Megan has flown hundreds of first-class flights. She is familiar with passengers in Zegna suits, briefcases, and silver Rolex watches. For her, right means white, elegant, and walking with a ticket between her fingers as a declaration: "I belong here." Eli is not like that. Not because he was wearing a black hoodie or sneakers, but because of his dark brown skin, the way he looked around, excited and wary, as if he were always apologizing for being there. And in Megan's mind, that was enough to raise a question mark. "Sorry, sir, this section is first class only," she said, smiling, but the smile was cold as metal. Eli raised the card gently. "I know. I'm seat 4A. She took the card, glanced at it, her lips pressed together. No, sorry for the misunderstanding. No embarrassment. She looked back at Eli as if to say, "How could you?" And then, with a voice as sweet as sugar, but as hard as a knife, "Just making sure. We've had people try before." The colleague next to her, a young flight attendant, looked at Eli and then looked away. No one defended her. No one reminded Megan that what she had just said was racist. Because in first class, discrimination doesn't need to be shouted. It's in the eyes, in the half-jokes, in every step you take trying to block someone like Eli. Eli took a deep breath and nodded politely. "Thanks for checking." He walked on, leaving behind Megan's twisted smile and the curious glances that were beginning to spread across the cabin. Little did anyone know that in a few minutes, Megan herself would wish she had never said those words, because the person she just looked down on was Marcus Brooks' son. And the name Brooks isn't just printed on a ticket, it's etched into the history of the airline Megan works for. The air in the first-class cabin seemed to stop for a moment. Eli had just placed his small backpack in the overhead compartment of seat 4A when Megan returned, not leaving, not passing by as if everything was clear. Instead, she stood there, still holding the passenger list, her eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you absolutely sure you're at the right gate?" The question was light, almost a concern, but underneath it was a question mark straight to character. Eli slowly turned around. His voice was not loud but clear. "Yes, my ticket is valid. Please feel free to verify." No embarrassment, no anger, just certainty, something he learned from his father, to stand by the truth without shouting. Megan stared at the boarding pass again, as if searching for a typo, some oversight to justify her suspicions. Around, a few people began to pay attention. An older woman sipping her white wine shook her head slightly, not in anger, but because she had seen this too many times. The head shake of weariness. A man in a suit in a nearby chair glanced at Eli and then looked down, his eyes filled with regret, as if wondering if he would have the courage to speak up if things went any further. But Megan didn't stop at her gaze. She leaned over, pointing toward the exit. "I'm just saying, we don't want any confusion. Economy is 2 cabins back. It happens all the time." Eli narrowed his eyes. His heart was beating fast, not with fear, but with the familiarity of this moment. Situations where he had to prove his worth, not with his voice, not with his demeanor, but with every piece of paper, every notch on a ticket. "Miss," he said, his voice low and calm, "I've shown you my seat. It's right there. 4A, you're welcome to scan it again." Megan hesitated. She was not used to this calm. She waited for him to get angry, to raise his voice, what she would call disruptive behavior. But this boy just stood there, soft, confident, and unwavering. That's what bothers her the most. A moment later, she tapped the scanner and a beep sounded. Seat confirmed. Eli sat down quietly and buckled his seatbelt. He said nothing more, but his silence spoke louder than any accusation. Megan turned away, her lips pursed, and the eyes of the passengers around her continued to follow him. Not out of curiosity, but because they had just witnessed something familiar, but not easy to admit. Eli didn't know their names. He didn't care. But he could feel it. The looks were starting to change. And sometimes that's enough to start an earthquake. In first class, seat 1A, the one closest to the window where the first light of dawn always seeped in before anyone else, Eli sat quietly. That seat had been a vision of him in his dreams, as a skinny boy lying on his father's shoulders, sharing half a loaf of cold bread on a night bus ride across the state. He had pointed to an airplane in the sky and said, "I want to sit right by the window, like someone important." And today you were sitting there. A small leather bag was placed neatly at his feet. He wore a simple blue shirt, no logo, no brand. His shoes were old but clean. His back was straight. His eyes did not wander around. No one would guess that this was the excellent valedictorian of a prestigious school, preparing to embark on a new journey in his life. But even without looking, he could feel the atmosphere. The glances that passed by, the silence that rippled like waves around the luxurious lake where everything was in place, except him. And then, the click of high heels, neat, each step as if practiced in the mirror. Megan shows up, again. Gone was the skepticism or the pretense of friendliness. Her gaze was now cold determination, a conviction born of privilege and habitual control. "There seems to be a mistake in the system," she said, barely audible, her voice low but cold enough to freeze the air around her. "Your ticket is incorrect." She held out her hand. No request, no threat, just a familiar gesture, as if she had done it dozens of times before with people she deemed out of place. Eli didn't argue, didn't sigh, didn't look up. He just bowed his head slightly, opened his phone. His finger slowly slid down, clicking on the unsent message. The screen was blank. The message was only a few words long. "Dad, I think they're making me leave the seat." He pressed send. No tears, no expression. Just a young man under 20, learning to be silent in a world that doesn't belong to him. Eli stood slowly, hefted the bag as if it weighed no more than a notebook. Didn't bump into anyone, didn't spill anything, left no trace. But something in the room was different, a silence no one dared to name. In a row of seats nearby, a young stewardess stood by the service booth. Her brown hair was tied back, her uniform neat. She said nothing, but her eyes followed Eli, a confused, disturbed look, as if she were witnessing something that should never have happened. Not here, not to someone like him. That look is an apology that can never be expressed in words. Eli stepped out of first class, not because he was wrong, but because you chose silence, which is sometimes more powerful than anything that can be justified by words. A silence that carries weight. And at the same time, at the other end of the airport, in an upscale lounge, where the lights were warm and the music soft, Marcus Brooks put down his coffee cup. He had just received a text message. The screen was still on. He didn't read it again. No need. The people sitting nearby suddenly stopped talking, as if they sensed a change in the atmosphere. No one understood what had happened. But everyone recognized. The man whose expression had just changed. Who was he? His name is Marcus Brooks, and the person who was just insulted was his son. Flight 841 was about to close. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds, a veteran pilot with 20 years of experience and thousands of hours of flight time in all kinds of terrain and climate, was completing his final safety check. Everything was going as it always did, in the right order, at the right pace. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until a signal rang through the internal earpiece, a sharp, deep tone, encrypted with the highest level of security. This was no ordinary signal. It was a priority line, where only emergencies or direct orders from the highest levels of the company were allowed to intervene. Captain Reynolds. The voice rang out clearly, deep and calm, carrying the weight of a man whose name alone made others pause. Marcus Brooks here. Reynolds stopped what he was doing. He looked up and glanced at his co-pilot. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to ask who it was. There was no one in the airline business who didn't know Marcus Brooks, not from the newspapers or the billboards, but from the stories passed around among the crews, about a young man who started out cleaning wings at night and now had a fleet to his name. Reynolds straightened his posture, his back straightening as if by reflex from his military days. His voice dropped as if addressing the CEO directly. "Yes, sir," he replied. "Just one command, very short, no need to repeat. Call her in, now." Crew-only sign came on. A flight attendant hurried into the passenger compartment and spoke briefly to Megan. She left her post, still calm, light-footed, erect, smoothing her scarf as if she were entering a meeting room rather than being called in. But as the cockpit door opened and her eyes met Captain Reynolds' stony face, something inside her began to crack. There was no more polite smile. There was no more nod. Reynolds said nothing, just tilted his head and pointed to the open radio, where that deep voice still spoke, clear, each word like a knife cutting through the fog. "Megan, this is Marcus Brooks. I believe we have something to clarify." She stood there. The cockpit was dead silent, as if the entire plane were holding its breath. Megan's breathing was heavy, her gaze unfocused. Her chest tightened, not because she knew what was coming, but because for the first time in hundreds of flights, she realized she was no longer in control. There are no excuses. There are no technical reasons. There are no systemic errors that can stand up to the one truth. The person she rejected, insulted, pushed down to an economy seat is the son of the person who controls the flight routes she works on every day. The storm does not come with a roar. It comes with silence. A silence that carries the weight of justice, dignity, and truth that cannot be hidden by uniforms or titles. And this time, Megan isn't the one making the decisions. The cockpit had just closed behind Megan, but the echo of the voice inside seemed to still ring in her ears. She stepped out of the cabin, her gait no longer as straight as before. Her legs wobbled, though the plane floor had never shaken. The steps of someone whose belief in her status as inviolable had just been uprooted. In her hand, the internal memo from her superiors was still warm. There was not a single harsh word of reprimand, not a single word of shouting, but each line weighed like lead against the honor she had built up over the years. It contained a phrase that any airline employee would understand as a point of no return, subject to immediate review under discriminatory conduct. Megan's palms were sweaty. She smoothed the hem of her uniform, trying to keep her appearance from looking too disheveled. But even her fingernails, usually painted to perfection, scratched against the fabric, as if searching for a final foothold in her free fall. She glanced at the first-class seats. Eli is still there, still sitting upright. The glass in his hand reflected the soft yellow light, tilting slightly with each sip of water. No pretension, no accusing gaze, no mocking words. Just a young man, as calm as if he had never been pulled from his seat so long ago, as if the storm that had just blown past had been but a breeze brushing across the pages of an open book. Megan stopped, standing a few feet away. Her eyes met Eli's for a split second, and that was the first and only moment she felt seen. Really. Not as a flight attendant in a crisp uniform, not as a representative of professional standards, but as someone who had just caused harm and who, even though she wasn't being yelled at, felt as though she were sitting in the back row where no one cared who walked by. She swallowed, then turned away. Behind her, no one laughed, no one whispered, because the entire cabin seemed to have just witnessed something very rare happening in the air, a silent reversal. Not with stormy power, but with the undeniable calm of someone who had nothing to prove. Because his presence, simply, was the answer. No warning, no security signal, no announcement over the loudspeaker. The cabin door opened with a simple motion, but the silence that followed was enough to make the entire cabin stop breathing. No one knew why their hearts had slowed. No one knew what was happening. Until a figure appeared at the front of the cabin, carrying with him the same suffocating silence that had followed him through the control rooms where decisions shook an industry. Marcus Brooks boarded the plane as if he had belonged there before it was built. He looked at no one and needed no introduction. He needed no business card to be recognized, no uniform to remind him that he had been at every low point of the airline, from the technician who cleaned the fuselage to the first person to extinguish a crisis with his own two hands. Today, he came not as an honored guest, nor even as a proud CEO. He came as a father, to a son who had been denied the seat he deserved. Behind him stood two men in matching gray suits, their eyes cold and steady, their faces as closed as classified files. Neither of them spoke, but the message was unmistakable as they walked with Marcus. What had happened on this flight would not end quietly. This was no longer just a flight, it was a scene, a place where the truth was about to be put back where it belonged. Marcus advanced, each step seeming to strike a nerve with everyone present. Without haste, but without stopping once, he passed through rows of seats where passengers were shrinking involuntarily, as if his presence made them more aware of where they were sitting, of the silence they had chosen to maintain when witnessing the injustice that had taken place only minutes before. No one turned away, no one spoke. All eyes were on him, as if on something greater than fame, a justice that had yet to be spoken, but which was already manifest in that tall figure. In the front row, Eli sat still. He didn't stand, didn't lean toward his father. There was just a glance, brief but enough. They'd been through enough to know that sometimes words weren't necessary. Marcus nodded, and in that moment, both father and son knew that what was happening was no longer their business. It was a shake-up, for those who thought power existed only in uniforms and name tags. Megan stood at the back of the cabin. When she realized that the person who had just entered was not a VIP, but the man who held the future of the airline she worked for, her usual composure shattered like a mask exposed to the light. No one called her name, but with each step Marcus took, her hands began to sweat. Her polished nails, once a symbol of neatness, scratched the fabric of her uniform like a desperate reflex. Marcus didn't stop in front of her. He stood facing the cockpit, exchanging a brief glance with Captain Reynolds. The man understood, no instructions needed. It was clear. And then, for the first time since boarding the plane, Marcus turned, his eyes landing on Megan. No scolding, no questioning. But that silence was a stronger indictment than any accusation. Megan bowed her head, slowly. No one had asked her to. But she knew she had been seen, not just by Marcus, but by every passenger watching, by those who had chosen silence, but were now forced to face the consequences. The plane landed in the mild sunshine. The doors opened. Passengers gradually left the cabin, step by step, dragging suitcases and stories no one told. But at the back of the cabin, there was one person who stood longer than necessary. Not because the luggage was too heavy, but because her heart was heavy with something else, something she had never honestly faced before. Megan walked out last. No longer the sharp eyes, no longer the powerful appearance of someone who once held the entire first-class cabin as her own personal stage. Now, every step she took was a silent confession. Her palms were sweaty, her neat uniform now loose as if it could no longer hold her proud self of yesterday. A week later, a letter arrived in the legal department's inbox. Not from a lawyer, not through the communications department. It was a simple email, no catchy subject line, no fancy formatting. The writer was Megan R. Doyle, a former flight attendant who had just been officially removed from all international flights. At the beginning of the letter, she wrote, "I kept quiet for years. I always believed that following the process was enough to make me right. But today, I saw what I had been hiding from for so long, the difference in how I saw a passenger, just because of the color of their skin." She recounted it without excuses or blame. It began 10 years ago, on a night flight between Atlanta and Seattle. A black boy, about 16, wearing a hoodie and headphones, boarded first class with a faded ticket. She had turned him away. Without asking, without verifying, she remembered it clearly because she had turned back and smiled at a passenger behind her, as if she had done the right thing to keep the standards of the premium cabin. 10 years, and she never thought about that boy again, until the day she met Eli. Megan wasn't asking for forgiveness. In the letter, she simply said that if she could go back in time, she wished she'd had the courage to ask him his name. Not to check off the list, but to remember. So she wouldn't make the same mistake with someone else next time. Eli didn't read the letter. There was no need. Because at the last moment, when the cabin was nothing but a silent space between father and son, Eli turned. Marcus nodded. No compliments, no questions. Just a look, filled with a rekindled belief that his son had somehow made justice not a gift for the few, but a right for all. No one on the flight that day knew the full story behind the young man sitting silently by the window. No one cared who his father was. After all, kindness had become the norm, no longer a privilege. As the plane glided through the air, drawing proud curves across the sky, Eli looked out, his eyes reflecting the calmness only found in those who have experienced injustice, but have not let it define them. Marcus nodded again, a wordless agreement between two generations who have known what it means to hold back and what it means to stand up. Justice, after all, is not something to be given. It is something to be maintained, by actions, by words, and by unyielding persistence in the face of wrong. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.